It was right there, a shard of the universe rushing through space. And there I was, gazing up from the comfort of my father's hand-built farmhouse rooftop in the middle of nowhere. Nothing noteworthy happened in all the years we lived out there in the countryside. This meteor shower was the highlight of my entire life, which is why I was transfixed by that one falling rock, brighter than the others, with a little of amazement glazed over my eyes. I wished I could reach out and touch it. The asteroid made a U-turn and descended from the sky like a falcon diving for its prey, almost as if in response to my appeal. I stood there in awe as it sailed overhead and slammed into the wooded area behind my father's land. Surprisingly, there was no sound or explosion, only the rustle of tree leaves as it fell through the woodland canopy. To make matters further stranger, I swear I spotted a faint red glow originating from the collision site. After the initial shock wore off, I climbed down from the roof and ran as fast as my thin legs would allow. Into the woods. I had a rough sense of where the thing had landed, so I dashed in that direction, intending to bring home a piece of space rock to show my father. If I'm lucky, it'll be a treasure exciting, enough to keep him from being angry that I ventured off into the woods by myself. All I could do was hope. I eventually arrived to a little clearing where the moonlight gently touched the land, providing me with a better understanding of the plants and animals surrounding me. Many little animals were urgently running north for no apparent reason. I reasoned that the meteor's impact had scared the wildlife nearby, so I chose to go in the opposite way. After about 10 minutes of my unplanned trip through the bush, I discovered the source of the weird illumination I'd observed previously. It wasn't a meteor. A metallic pod of some type sat in a small hole in the ground, replete with a blinking beacon extending from its surface like an antenna. The craft itself was spherical, and at least twice as tall as I was. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I was completely taken aback. Before I could get a better look, a hatch from its side slammed me back into the woods. I scurried behind the nearest tree, my pulse thumping. With bated breath, I carefully positioned my head around the trunk and gazed on the thing. I had no idea what to expect. Was it a top-secret military weapon? Perhaps a remote control device created by a brilliant hermit living nearby? Would a little green man welcome me and demand to speak with my leader? Whatever happened, my gaze was fixed on that metallic capsule, for better or ill. A massive puddle of dark violet ooze formed at the object's base when a dark violet ooze flowed from it. The slimy substance then scaled the pod's exterior, coating it from top to bottom. The light above ceased, flashing as the slime went around the spherical. The purple liquid was ejected from the spaceship and landed on the earth below. It began to take on a more humanoid shape there. The hue of the ooze varied as it changed. It turned white and hazy, like to television static. Appropriately, TV and radio talk quickly filled the forest. This gadget was collecting signals from thin air and regurgitating lines from famous shows that had long since aired. At least, it appeared to be doing so. With my mouth open in astonishment, I unconsciously began leaning forward. The signals abruptly stopped, and I landed headfirst on a pile of dead limbs, making a loud crunch. I watched the white figure turn to face me from my new vantage point. It then began to speak to me. Though Yeho's there. Its voice was weak and artificial, with a low, monotonous rumble and terrible reverb. I got myself up and went back home faster than I had ever run before, terrified for my life. I resumed my vantage point on the roof and meticulously assessed the property. Once I was sure I wasn't being followed, I hopped through my bedroom window and crawled into bed, hoping it was all a dream. An adventure fabricated by my wild imagination. Only it were that simple, but wishful thinking rarely pays off. I arrived downstairs the next day to the familiar smells of eggs and bacon. On Sundays, my father always made a big breakfast. The sight that met me as I entered the dining room, on the other hand, was anything but familiar. A man in a clean-cut suit sat across from my father at the table, sporting a bowler hat and a striped tie. We didn't usually entertain visitors, so I was perplexed. "Son, Mr. Grovewood here. His car broke down a few miles away, so he'll be staying with us for a few nights until he can get things straightened out. How do you do, sport?" I stayed mute, worried by the man's presence and shaken from the night before. "He's paying us a generous sum to stay here, so you best treat him with respect." My father's expression clearly conveyed his meaning. As a result, I complied. "I'm fine, sir. Thank you for inquiring." I ran outside to tend to the farm after the man smiled, albeit awkwardly. I wasn't sure why, but I'd lost my appetite. Something didn't seem to add up. After his automobile broke down, how did this traveler find the farm? The trees literally enveloped us. Maybe it was just bad luck. Doubtful. I was starting to suspect that his appearance the day after that object landed in the woods wasn't a coincidence, but this wasn't a thought I was brave enough to pursue. After all, I had already convinced myself that the previous night's events had been a nightmare. I tried not to think about it, because the man will be gone in a few days anyway. The next few evenings were strange. Mr. Grovewood tried to watch a sitcom with us while we ate dinner, but his emotions were unusual. He seemed perplexed by the presentation and only laughed when he noticed us smiling. And this wasn't just any chuckle. It was a raucous guffaw of very unpleasant proportions. I was almost happy when he was called away by a business partner, even though I didn't hear a single word exchanged. The next night, I went downstairs to get a glass of milk, only to find Mr. Grovewood eating a raw steak from the freezer. "It's just a little midnight snack," he remarked when I asked him about it. "Believe me, a little color is excellent for the body." Needless to say, I dashed back to my room without my milk. Last night, however, I got actually terrified. I overheard Mr. Grovewood on the phone as I walked past the guest room to the restroom. He definitely spoke this time. "Mr. Grovewood. Thank you. Did you receive the information I sent you?" Theon. "Mr. Grovewood. Yes, this is the language we'll be using from now on. We must blend in with the crowd to avoid suspicion. Advertisements, hey-oe. Mr. Grovewood. It's a beautiful sight. Minerals, water, and life forms abound. You and the others will enjoy it here." Phone. "Mr. Grovewood. As long as you are prepared, there's no turning back now. This will be our new residence." Phone. "Mr. Grovewood. Thank you. There is no necessity. Why spend resources on transportation when I can beam you down instantly? I have 2 vessels available for capture." Hello. Static. Error. Hello, is this thing on? How the hell? Static. Error. Captain William Brink here. Static. Okay. I understand. Captain William Brinkman of Bosun Fleet Nova here to broadcast. Tula 13 is the target of our exploration and retrieval expedition. We were supposed to arrive on the planet in 30 days, but we've had serious complications in the last 15 hours. We've used up 20% of our fuel and have only enough food for 14 days. Even if we expand it, it will not suffice. Someone will perish from starvation. And static. Error. Bosun Fleet Nova Transmission 30 comes to an end. Static advertisements. Captain William Brinkman here, broadcasting for the record. Pilot Randall Cummings experienced an unusually severe case of space psychosis during our sleep zone. Mr. Cummings basically went insane. Before killing Dr. Ivan Scholar and the ship's co-pilot, Deborah Yin, he destroyed 70% of the ship's operational capabilities. Debbie's screams were what jolted us awake. Mr. Cummings was stabbing her in her bed when we arrived. We restrained him, myself, Major Cole, and our ecologist, Juna Sachs, but it was too late for Debbie. We couldn't stop the bleeding. She died minutes later in my arms. Mr. Cummings banged his head on the corner of the bed rail as we were restraining him, producing a serious cut. We attempted to treat it, however. Static. Error. The ship is currently 40% operational, but the MEA's operational machine is still offline. It may have performed the surgery required to save Mr. Cummings. As a group, we decided that one of us had to put him out of his agony. I volunteered after some awkward wrangling. I attempted to make it as swift and painless as possible by placing a pillow over his face till he no longer. Static. Error. Bosun Fleet Nova Transmission 31 comes to an end. Captain William Brinkman, transmitting for historical purposes, will be in the heart of an asteroid storm, the size of 2 football fields in 20 minutes. We don't have any pilots, so it'll be up to me and Major Cole to navigate the asteroids. I have to be honest. I don't think we'll make it out of this minefield alive. Please tell my wife and daughter that I love them when you receive this communication. Static. Error. Advertisements. Bosun Fleet Nova Transmission 32 comes to an end. Static. It's Captain Brinkman. A cranking, sputtering noise is heard in the background, followed by heavy breathing. We survive the asteroids, but the ship is severely damaged. He takes a big breath. Something terrible came through the ship's top load. It originated from one of the asters. Static. Error. Bosun Fleet Nova Transmission 33 comes to an end. Static. Captain William Brinkman of Bosun Fleet Nova here, transmitting for the record. I'm stuck in the transmission locker. It consumed Cole and Sachs. Captain Brinkman sobs. It ripped them open and devoured them like nothing. It sprang from nowhere and chewed Juna's head like a dog chewing a fucking bone. He begins gasping, gulping for oxygen, and puking. I wanted to help, but it was too late. I was too afraid. It's the eyes. Static. Error. Debbie and Randall's corpses were used as some sort of fertilizing pod. They have these massive spores all over their bodies. I watched as some of them started to hatch. There's a big bang at the door, followed by a heartbreaking scraping sound. You can hear the captain's terror in his voice. Oh, it's at the door. I detonated explosives all around the ship. I'm not going to die alone. These fucking things are coming with me. Every crew member on board Bosun Fleet Nova will be dead when you receive this signal. Do not dispatch a rescue squad. Bang. Static. Do not, I repeat, do not send. Another bang. Then the sound of the door breaking open causes a loud screech, like metal scratching on metal. It's here. Tell my wife and daughter I love them. A huge growl fills the air, interrupted by a piercing screech. Fuck you, you ugly son of a bitch. A terrifying impact is heard, followed by Captain Brinkman's horrific cry. Static. Error. Bosun Fleet Nova Transmission 34 comes to an end. Transmissions for Bosun Fleet Nova are coming to an end. Computer, wake up. The monitor's face was covered in green static. The ship's computer system never totally shuts down. However, it is occasionally asked to sleep during long periods of inactivity, as the backup generators dedicated all available power to emergency functions. Red lights flashed on and off. Mason Straightwater, the ship's chief engineer, is among those on deck, except that there aren't a lot of hands on deck. Mason hasn't seen anyone else since waking up to sirens and clambering down to the ship's mainframe. Computer to assess damage and figure out what was going on. After several painful seconds, the static was replaced by green binary numerals, followed by a single, horizontal green line. This green line shifted and changed into 2 words, which the computer's text-to-speech mechanism almost immediately repeated. Awaiting input. Mason moved in close to the monitor and spoke clearly. "Computer, what happened?" The computer responded milliseconds later. "Please provide name and rank." Mason wiped his brow with his hand. "I don't have time for this," he thought, but he knew he had to follow the computer's algorithm. First and foremost, name and rank, so the computer knows who it's talking to, and what certain confidential information it must keep hidden from lower-ranking workers. The Mason Straightwater, engineer in charge. After a brief pause, green lines changed into words and semantics as the machine spewed out its response. M. Straightwater Mason. Greetings from the head of engineers stationed in Sector I. How can I assist you? Computer, the ship is currently in emergency mode. What in the world happened? The ship SSE Sentinel is under Emergency Protocol F6, reserved for hull breaches and hostile beings. On board, he says after a brief pause, Sentinel's current status is a serious hull breach in Sector VI on the starboard bow. Sector VI's entrances and exits have been sealed off. The ship has been boarded by possible hostiles. Please follow Emergency Evacuation Protocol T1. Evacuate ship immediately via lifeboats in Sector II and abandon everything. The computer immediately came to a halt, clearly finished with its analysis. Mason was not pleased. The whole thing didn't add up. Where had everyone else gone during the evacuation? Why hadn't another engineer or his Kyo roused him from his slumber? Mason couldn't leave the room quite yet since he still needed to ask the computer some questions. Computer, where has everyone gone? What happened to the SSE Sentinel's crew? A lengthier pause. The computer would never take this long to answer a simple question like conducting crew member inventory. The computer finally blinked and scrolled out its nasty response. There are 22 life forms currently alive on this ship. Mason sat back in horror. This was not an option. Only 22 people remained from the ship's original crew of around 1,500. Did everyone else evacuate, and the rest are still waiting for word? No. There was another aspect in the equation that he couldn't perceive. Whatever was going on, whatever had triggered the ship's alarms and emergency protocol, was unlike anything Mason had learned in his training. This is much above my pay grade, he reasoned. Mason recognized it wasn't finished when the computer blipped again. Off the previous 1492 staff and crew of SSE Sentinel, 2 remain alive. Mason's heart stopped beating. He sat astonished in front of the computer, unable to speak. This was not going to happen, he reasoned. This is not a possibility. There are only 2 persons left. I was left aboard the ship with another poor chump. But if it's just the 2 of us, who are the other 20? M. Or green lettering appeared on the monitor as the computer clicked in weird. I'd like to correct your prior question, Mr. Straightwater. This spacecraft currently has 21 living forms on board. Only 1 SSE Sentinel survivor remains. Mason's mental state was deteriorating by the second. The consequences of that sentence were too terrifying to contemplate. He needed to move quickly, and he wanted to know exactly what he was up against. Computer, the captain said, bring up all available ship security feeds in Sector VI. Request processed and acknowledged. Several monitors split the screen and showed the crushing devastation instead of the murky green static. Mason saw immobile victims, some fully intact, others with nasty lacerations, and the remainder completely ripped apart. He flipped between cameras, each one displaying an image of one of his crewmates who had died. As he panned to the crew quarters, it appeared that some people had died in their sleep, while others were frozen in place as they tried to claw their way out the door. Some had perished, some had horrific wounds, and some had attempted to fight back, but all 1,500 crew members had died. Mason finally requested monitors for each sector, scouting each region one by one, unsuccessfully hunting for the alien monsters responsible for the chaos. He didn't notice them until he flipped through Sector IX. There were only 2 of them in the image, but it was enough for Mason to understand what he was up against. It would be an insult to call them human. Hunched dark bodies dwarfed every element in the corridor, their hideous leathery heads almost reaching the ceiling. They shuffled with comical speed, as if whatever they did was 3 times faster than usual. Their legs moved inexorably, barely leaving the ground and scuttling close to their horrible bodies before the next leg did the same. They resembled bipedal spiders, stopping briefly before clambering through doors and air vents. Their lanky arms extended from their upper midsection and scraped the ground, dragging prolonged and long talons gleaming with the remains of the fallen with them. Mason was horrified to discover that he could only capture 2 critters on camera throughout the entire facility. He had no idea where the other 18 could be. Outside the small room, a thump and shuffle of activity gave him his answer. The scuttling sound of hollow limbs on metallic frames came from nowhere, but it rose frightfully and suddenly from the abyss beyond the computer room, and it was approaching ever closer with alarming speed. Mason swiftly returned his gaze to the monitor. "Computer," he said, "shut down mainframe access doors right away." Request acknowledged. The solitary door leading into the computer room closed and locked with a synthetic hiss. Mason had a bad feeling something was wrong when the small peephole on the door darkened. The creatures had arrived to take their final victim. Mason fixed his gaze on his evil adversary. The visage that peered back at him had no features, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, no strange proboscis, just a dark leathery face. He's seen the bloodshed on the security cameras, and he knows that these beasts might easily open the frail door and enter this chamber. Forceful break-ins have been discovered throughout the ship. It may take minutes, if not seconds, if several of them work together and were present in the room to complete the task. But the thing kept staring at Mason. "It's waiting," he reasoned. "It's waiting for me to act. But what?" Mason's attention was drawn back to the computer by another blip. The mainframe access door has been shut and sealed. This action, however, will obstruct your evacuation attempt. Could I suggest an alternative? "What are those things outside this room?" "Computer," Mason insisted. "What brings them here? What do they expect of me?" He was becoming unstable, bordering on insane. The protective curtains encircling his idea of normalcy were consumed in flames, and the entire veneer of his existence was crumbling all around him. "Life forms are being processed. Please be patient. Unknown species. Unknown genus. Unknown family. Members. Carnivora is the order. Classification. Unknown. Chordata is the phylum. Animalia is the kingdom." Analysis. These are hostile creatures with enormous strength and should be approached with extreme caution. The average level of danger was 9.8. A long pause ensued. Mason returned his gaze to the filthy glassy peephole. The same wrinkled gray visage stared back at him, or so it appeared. Finally, the figure's gangly body moved to the right, only to be replaced by another nasty face from the left side. There were more to be found. Mason stared in awful and mortal fascination for interminable seconds. The computer beeped, and Mason returned to his work, just as the face at the door was replaced by another. "As for your second question, Mr. Straightwater, I can tell you why they've come. But first, I guess you'd like to know what they expect from you." The computer's tone and accent had quickly shifted. Mason reasoned that something was wrong with all of this. The computer program aboard the SSE Sentinel was indeed ominous, since when the next message came in, the monitor had changed from green static to a dark reddish clarity. The display was no longer full of grainy static. It was now as clear and bold as the blood from the crew's bodies. "They require you to bear witness." Bear witness to what? Mason stumbled. "To the absolute horrors that exist outside your ship's walls," the software responded. "For far too long, mankind has lived on his Earth rock of consolation. He'd occasionally stare up at the night sky, wondering what lay beyond the stars. As religion gave way to science, man's perception of life outside. His planet moved from impossible to a distinct possibility. However, despite decades of space research and colonization, no significant evidence of alien life has been discovered. Until now, that is. Mason Straightwater, the computer continued, I beg you not to take this issue personally, despite the fact that I am nothing more than a machine learning algorithm. I fully understand human nature and the horror you must be experiencing right now. You were the unfortunate sample who strayed too far beyond the Solar Council's control. You and your team have come across something sinister, something you've never seen before and aren't prepared to deal with. Mason couldn't think of anything to say. Slowly, a steady wet slap hammered from the closed door. The monsters were eager to come in, but not so eager as to push the door open. They appeared to have been given specific orders to stand by and wait a bit longer. Mason soon discovered his voice. Are you telling me you're with them? What are those? You've been guiding this ship on a suicide mission the entire time. That is not a fair assumption to make, the computer said coyly. My systems are not currently, and have never been, under the influence of any foreign entity or virus. I've always been on the crew's side. Believe me, how can I trust something that just killed my entire team like sheep? Mason's anger frayed in the face of this fresh revelation. Understandably, I do not expect you to accept the current situation you are in. Perhaps my intentions will become obvious with time. What are your plans? What role do you play in all of this? Where do you fit into this pirate scheme? It's simple. My algorithm was created by man to benefit man. My primary and most absolute prerogative function is to protect human life and well-being. My second priority is to protect the crew's safety, but that rule is null and void if my primary role must be completed first and foremost. The computer clicked and whirred, and Mason looked up from the display as the door let out a mechanical hiss. Mason saw the total scary force of the monsters when the door to the computer room opened. They slithered into the little chamber one by one. Only 3 could fit inside the room, but Mason noticed there were considerably more outside. Their backs bent to fit their enormous stature, and their heads brushed against the ceiling. They must be at least 3 meters tall, Mason reasoned. Mason lunged for his holster inches from his gun, ready to fight if any of them made an unexpected move. Nonetheless, they all stood by idly. They were waiting for a signal from the computer once more. The monitor wavered and blinked, whirring, clicking, and clacking until it eventually sent out a single blip to refocus Mason's attention. Don't be scared, Mason. They will not murder you. You are not going to perish at their hands. However, I cannot guarantee that you will leave this location unscathed. Mason wasn't going down without a fight. So, what do they want from me, you ASHAP program? I've previously responded to your question. They'd like you to be a witness. God forbid. What is it witness for? They want you to testify in front of the rest of your kind. They want you to tell the entire human race the truth. There is life in space, and they're not interested in you. The monitor blinked and then went dark. As the beast surged toward Mason, he drew his revolver from its holster. He fired 2 rounds before being engulfed by the horrible monstrosities who bore down on him like savage beasts. The Solar Council of Greater Earth has issued a newsflash report. Earlier this week, authorities discovered the SSE Sentinel floating on the outskirts of the Sagittarius Quadrant. Every member of the ship's crew was discovered dead on the spot by police and the Galactic Guard, except just one. The lone survivor was identified as Mason Douglas Straightwater, the ship's chief engineer. He was discovered comatose, his body strewn with wounds, cuts, and contusions. His malnourished body was later revived and repaired by doctors, but his mental state had worsened dramatically. Straightwater kept babbling on about being a witness, and they want nothing to do with us. According to his physicians, Straightwater was admitted to the Ares Mental Institute for further investigations and eventual rehabilitation. It will be a long time before he is entirely healed. Authorities examined every corpse on the ship, all of which were in various stages of rigor mortis. The cause of death differed from person to person. On occasion, fingerprint data or DNA samples were insufficient to identify the bodies. Throughout the investigation, one thing stood out above the rest and perplexed authorities. What caused this mayhem? The ship had a hull breach and a strong break-in, but no hostile entities were detected or identified on board. According to the police report, Straightwater, the lone survivor, was discovered in the ship's mainframe computer room. Surprisingly, the computer was turned on and operating next to his body. The Galactic Guard stated in their classified files that the monitor held two phrases beneath the grainy green static the entire time they were on board the ship, awaiting input. File for Interstellar Colony Collective Government. Document 647. Colony Failure Assessment Report Date 30 May 2374, 247 Salma Chakroun, CFA Basic Data Collector, reported. Status of information. Classified. Superior officers only. Report. I've been on active duty for 4 years and have done 23 failure assessment missions, and I've never saw or experienced anything like what I'm about to explain in this report. I and the crew of the CFA frigate Aurora were sent from ICC Outpost Norma on a data recovery mission to a relatively new planetary orbital colony. Hecate T-14J, nicknamed Crossroads, was the name of the colony station. It is located in the Scrutum Crux arm, since the colony was exploring the safety of settling closer to the galaxy's center for reasons such as radiation protection. However, prior to the warp acceleration, my preliminary research discovered certain classified files that were above my clearance level. This was unusual for me because CFA agents are supposed to have access to all failed colony information in order to assist with failure evaluation, or so I thought. We were around 3,000 parsecs away from the station, so we had to take a hyper-extended rest 2 days into the warp acceleration. As is customary, we awoke 2 days after our arrival. Not long after we were awakened, I was briefed on some of the finer specifics of our task, along with my team colleagues. According to our supervisory officer, no distress signal was sent from the station by a crew member. Therefore, mutiny or internal criminal activities were ruled out. What worried us was that there had been no contact between Crossroads and the ICC outposts closest to it for 3 weeks prior to our mission. Communications at newer stations can typically be unavailable for a week owing to communication disturbances such as solar activity or outages. An emergency response team is generally dispatched when a colony has been unresponsive for a full month. After the team approves, we are sent to observe the colony and collect electronic data or information from any survivors. However, I believe that the emergency crew was deployed after the first week due to the confidential nature of the colony's establishment. Our supervisor could only go so far as to say that a radiation meter read a swift and powerful energy signature, and then communications were quiet. While we were not given the classified material that would have helped us comprehend the nature of the colony's establishment, which I had been denied during my original investigation, we were told that the emergency response team discovered that the station had been abandoned. To the best of my knowledge, I have only witnessed or heard about a few CFA situations that were determined as colony abandonment. The majority were caused by external forces like as raids, although 2 were caused by crew paranoia. At the time, I was doing my best to rationalize the unusual circumstances that my team was in. Because the station was stated to be in excellent condition, a foreign attack, internal crime or rebellion, and natural disasters were ruled out. The emergency response team found no internal or external damage, and all equipment had been left in areas consistent with members stopping everything they were doing the instant they abandoned the station. I wasn't going to rule out crew paranoia because fear could have been a rationale for leaving equipment out. However, certain systems and programs required weekly service, or they would fail in various ways. This could result in power outages or system failures, which could lead to infrastructure depreciation or external damage to components, such as solar flaps. It was perplexing, but I was convinced that we would discover information that would explain the abandonment. We were then taught what to collect. Our 5-person team is made up of members who are each expert in a different field. Jamal is our ecological scientist. Farah is our psychology and sociology expert. Henrietta is our media and communications technician. Norman is the forensic examiner, and I am the basic data collecting specialist. Jamal was supposed to help Norman find organic evidence and check DNA findings in the ICC staff database. Farah was supposed to talk with emergency response workers to acquire information on the colony's initial observations. Henrietta would go through all communication logs looking for inbound or outbound signals, as well as communications received via the station's comm channels. Finally, and somewhat unsurprisingly, I had to collect routine basic data in all personal cabin logs, as well as meter and technical information from the station's bridge. This was consistent with every previous assignment I had received. I've been assigned with the identical tasks every time we've arrived at a planetary colony, solar orbiter, or planetary preliminary colony like this one. If I discover any strange information, I notify my commanding officer and reset all systems on board. Something unsettling about the ship was immediately obvious upon our arrival. The description of an abandoned colony in excellent condition appeared to be the least frightening scene, but it felt unearthly. Normally, when I come at a colony, I can sense that it will be abandoned. Certain characteristics contribute to the atmosphere, but this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I was hesitant to leave my team because of the air, the emptiness that existed. It was a deserted town. There was no trace of human presence that may indicate a mistake of any kind. Things appeared to have been dropped where they were being used. On my way to a bed section, I walked across a cafeteria kitchen where even components and mixing bowls appeared to be half-mixed. I've never been one to seriously question the conditions of my life. For my entire life, I have placed my trust in the observable. However, when the observable is inexplicable, I'm at a loss for words to convey how nervous I felt. But I'm getting ahead of myself. When we started having radio troubles, I had completed 3 of 10 bunk parts. We've experienced previous situations where external conditions messed with our channels, and we usually disregard them. However, these are only partial interferences. For several minutes at a time, there was no touch. I radioed to my supervisor around the 3rd time. We reconnected to ask whether I should skip to the ship's bridge to check radiation meters that were consistent with solar interference. He ruled against it due to the magnitude of the issues. Henrietta was summoned back to the ship to inspect communications, equipment, and enhance channels for improved reception. To be honest, I wanted to go to the bridge for more personal reasons. I was getting increasingly nervous about going to the sleeping portions. Every section I'd seen thus far seemed bizarre. None of the logs had yet shown any information that had been documented. The station had been up and running for a year and 3 months, therefore there had to be some kind of record made on these logs. However, the lack of information suggested one of 2 possibilities. Either the crew erased log entries in an attempt to conceal data, or no information was ever recorded. Something made me believe that the latter had occurred. This, however, should not have been possible. It was impossible for an entire station to go a year without logging any data. Things were silent for a while as I walked through the colony's halls. But things started to become peculiar after my eighth bunk portion. I had been keeping my thoughts to myself for quite some time. I was embarrassed to admit that I had a hunch that something strange was going on. I was sure I'd get yelled at for it. I mean, we're a bunch of folks who deal professionally with observable data, or at the very least, make it observable in some way. But I believe this was beyond our powers. How could a ship be brand new, unspoiled, and almost time frozen? I was wondering if anyone else had felt like they were being watched. I was constantly checking behind me to make sure I wasn't being followed. But I was always aware of something. It was constantly around. Yet it was never immediately behind me. I finally decided to open my mouth, intending to play it off as a joke if I was chastised. But there was no response when I spoke. I continually yelled out for Henrietta, Jamal, Norma, and our supervisor, but no one was responding on our channel. I reasoned that it could have been another radio cutoff. I was completely mistaken. I began to notice the feeling of being followed more frequently after feeling more alone, knowing there was no one to talk to. When I finished my 9th section, I realized there was something there. Something was approaching. It was ready to reveal itself to me. The energy was present. It began in the shadows, down the corridors, surged through my nerves, and made me tremble when I turned around to look for it. I admit that I began to feel apprehensive. I started walking faster along the halls, looking for the 9th section. I was breathing more heavily as I continued to listen to the radio for anyone. There are still no responses. Panic had begun to set in at this moment. I was growing disoriented and nervous, and it took me far longer than it should have to find the 10th bed section. I hesitated when I finally discovered the stairway I was supposed to take. I hadn't realized it before, but the portion I was going to enter had no power. The stairwell plunged into darkness, barely dimly lit by the red emergency lights that flashed on the walls. I stood for a few moments, sweaty, peering into the darkness. I could feel the energy of whatever was following it coming from within it. I wanted to rush back toward the frigate and abandon it, but I knew I'd be fired if I didn't finish my data collection on time. I had no choice but to go down there. I'd never turned down an assignment before for any reason. I began walking down the stairwell, counting each step. I was down in 24 stairs. I could barely see about 10 feet in front of me, with occasional glimpses further down when the emergency lights flashed. I returned my gaze to the light above for a split second before beginning to inch along the wall toward the end of the hallway where the logging computer was located. I began to sense the previous energy all around me. Something seemed to be somewhere I wasn't looking. I told myself that the faster I moved, the sooner I'd be out of there and back to the Aurora. I took a deliberate stride toward the computer. Something was at the end of the corridor behind me. In a panic, I took off running. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. It was present. It was as bright as day now, but it felt gloomy and blazing. I ran to enter my login information, and there was data on the drive. I copied the data to my drive, slightly surprised, and waited for the connection to be severed. It began to make its way down the corridor. My body began to tremble and sweat. The stress was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was playing with me by projecting it upon me. I was about halfway through downloading the drive when I started having a nervous breakdown. I started whispering to myself for the drive to hurry up, as if that would help. I could feel it exactly behind me when it was ended. My entire body was cold to the bone. I was unable to move. It was on my neck, stroking me with the purpose to frighten me. Then I heard Henrietta utter my name over the radio, and I yelled and dashed for the stairs. She yelled back, but I was in a frightened race back the way I came. I'm not sure how long it took, but Norman and Jamal eventually ran into me as I turned a corner into a hallway intersection. I was paranoid and agitated, to the point of being unresponsive and unintelligible. They returned me to the Aurora, and after some time to calm down, I told my supervisor about what had happened. What was perplexing was his explanation that there were no further radio cuts after Henrietta was dispatched to diagnose the problem. Furthermore, he was perplexed by my depiction of the 10th bunk section, claiming that the station text only identified 9 bunk sections. I was astonished and at a loss for words. Then I remembered the data from the log computer drives that I had rescued. We sat in his office, in front of his computer, and plugged in my drive. There were files on the drive with correct names, but all of the information on them was corrupted. I looked at my boss, still astonished, and at a loss for words. He had his palm on his chin and was staring at the television. He rose from his chair and closed his door, motioning for me to take a seat on the other side of his desk. He explained the classified nature of Crossroads establishment, which was experimental travel testing involving the usage of wormholes for instantaneous travel between 2 sites in deep space. When I sat, certified CFA agents had been dispatched with the emergency response team to collect data from bridge computers and meters that would corroborate an ICC research specialist's theory. This idea would demonstrate the existence of parallel universes as well as the ability to travel between them. While I cannot reach a definitive judgment regarding what happened on Crossroads, I do acknowledge that what I have described is unlike anything I have ever encountered. I believe that the cosmos and its mechanics can be explained by observable evidence, but what I went through was, and will remain, beyond my comprehension. Before concluding my report, I'd like to point out that I've noticed items that aren't there before. My room is mine, although I've never been in this one. Little details differ significantly, but one piece of evidence is unmistakably evident. Before we came, my desk badge said Selma, not Salma, to the best of my recall. The ship's engine screamed to life as the heads-up display flashed in around me, my hands gripping the control yokes with the kind of sweat that only drips when you're scared. All the stories ran wild in my head. Pilots puking up their liquefied organs, faces distorted with all the fear and pain of 1,000 lives. But our race's demise was as certain as my own. This was my chance. They tell you it's either glory or death, until you understand it's never a choice. These were our final stories, and they had to matter to us, not the universe. We will perish in the flames of conflict. I shouted as loud as I could as I watched the tracks ahead of me flash with electricity, my knuckles wide on the controls, amphetamines coursing through my veins. Magnetic catapult engaged, the onboard computer said. I began to speed as the ship rumbled around me, shrieking like a banshee, and the airlock at the end of the track opened out into an unending blackness. I'm not a wimp. I jerked the throttle back as I blasted into space at the speed of sound, breaking open a wormhole that drew me into a void of liquid stars. Even back then, I could sense it. My skin's slow prickle, the writhing doubt in the back of my mind as my family's begging expressions flashed through my eyes. As I fled in shame, their worlds fell apart. The gap hurled me into a blaze, and I banked down as the charred remains of a spacecraft passed by overhead. My skull thrumming with pain as I strained to anchor myself. I saw it. Black, feathered tendrils, and limbs writhed in tandem above the earth in a swirl of shifting substance, swimming forever through a huge mass of swarming eyes and razor-toothed maws. Images of mayhem and death flew through my head as I yelled with raw adrenaline, attempting to keep my mind from fading as streams of blood flowed from my eyes. But when another squadron charged forward from behind me, I had all the confidence I needed. As I steadied the wings, I noticed the capital ships tumble out of warp, their gigantic railguns firing in a blinding cascade of light. I yanked on the control yokes, and my ship shot forward, building increasing speed as its mass depleted. As the taste of blood filled my mouth, I hit the triggers, firing my guns repeatedly with a thunk, thunk, thunk that shook the ship to its core. As the spacecraft approached collision, I bowed it down, tearing beneath a flame-wrapped tentacle at inconceivable speeds before cranking it up again, the incredible power threatening to split my body in half. As a giant, deformed hand swooped at me, the warnings on the display flashed red, and I banked to the right. The metal rattled with power as I pushed the spacecraft as quickly as it could go, straight between the ripped skin of two fingers. An awful pain shuddered through my thoughts as the creature distorted and stretched, bending space and releasing a shockwave of horror and grief. My vision trembled and swelled as it hit me, whirling wildly into a spiraling waterfall of memories and doubt. Before the narcotic clouds subdued the lunacy with an overwhelming wrath, I could hear myself shouting, sending off erratic electrical signals in my brain. My muscles jerked and convulsed, and my vision flashed back to an oncoming torrent of shifting, black eyes that warmed through my thoughts in a way that could only be described as rape. I fired another round, my teeth clenched, the cockpit vibrating with rage as my guns flashed in the void. As I moved closer to collision, I drew back the throttle and vanished through the abomination, consumed quickly in a blaze of color that I could scarcely perceive. Its flesh surpassed the physical realm. It was howling within me, screeching in a nauseating, alien pandemonium that pricked my flesh and inundated my head with the maddened gibbering of primitive languages. The whole separated abruptly, and I blasted forward into the blackness of space, blood dripping from my mouth as I raced between the rows of capital artillery that cracked like thunder around me. I was in a blur of uncertainty and sickness when I felt the nauseating lumps of my dissolved intestines wrench up through my throat and my vomit splattered against the window. My hands slid from the controls, and the ship began to sway. My consciousness split between fractured hallucinations and the image of a frigate ahead of me losing control. It careened through space, colliding with a capital ship at my side, detonating in a violent explosion that battered my ship with searing shrapnel. The window broke into the void as jagged metal ripped into my ship at the speed of sound. I drifted there, suffocating and strapped into the gutted vessel, watching the remnants of the fleet spiral into madness, watching as the nightmare convulsed, surging its awful form toward the earth before engulfing it entirely, distant mountains torn from their foundations in clouds of debris, and entire oceans burnt away in seconds. As the creature consumed our universe whole, the substance corroded to dust, flaring its tentacles in a whirl of shifting motion as the sunlight swirled upon its mass. For once in my life, I was drowning in blackness as my thoughts bled away from existence, spiraling down into insignificance. Hand in hand with the legacy of my species, we were cleansed of our hatred for one beautiful, horrible moment in time, and at long last, we were together. It was a clear night in a tiny village outside San Francisco, California, when many inhabitants noticed a curious blue light falling from the sky. The following morning, a not-so-bright man in his early 20s went to investigate the field where the unusual blue object had landed and discovered a small crater. The curious local, a high school dropout who still lived with his single mother, who had never married or been in a committed relationship for more than a week, thought the stone might be worth some money. The space rock unexpectedly burst open, releasing a slimy, glossy black sludge. Rather than fleeing, Antonio Mansa, who, like far too many San Franciscans, was barely literate, unskilled, and yet another typical product of the San Francisco public school system, drew closer. He should have fled when the meteorite exploded. The gooey black creature that emerged from the blue stone was a parasitic symbiote, and it quickly latched onto Antonio's left arm and crept beneath his shirt. It released a toxin that caused its new host to forget what had just happened as it entered his body through a small cut on his shoulder and Antonio wandered back home in a drunken stupor, just like he did most other days when he didn't have enough drugs in his system to make a bull elephant hallucinate for a week. As a result, Antonio became Patient Zero. The parasitic outbreak that would permanently change the world would begin with him. She was fishing in a little stream in a small town in Alabama a week later when a clumsy man bumped into him and knocked him over. Jay helped the man to his feet and said nothing as he walked away. He wondered if the man was inebriated. Jay had no idea what was in store for him. He was extremely hungry that night and ate 4 times as much as he would ordinarily eat at the buffet. Jay had never eaten so much in one sitting, despite his voracious appetite. Jay awoke from a comfortable and restful night's sleep to discover that he was wearing a thick, rubbery black bodysuit. Except for Jay's ears, face, and the thick, shaggy brown hair on his head, the odd, stretchy suit covered everything. It measured at least 100 pounds and resembled a full-body set of bulging black muscles with a large white spider on the chest and back. It felt like soft rubber and was as tight and clingy as a diver's wetsuit. Jay didn't wear it last night. Despite the hefty suit's weight, Jay was able to move normally and felt strangely stronger. What in the world is this? I'm not going out in public with this thing on, however. Even without the gruesome head, terrible teeth, or bloodlust of the Venom creature from Marvel Comics, this outfit was destined to be a fashion nightmare in other ways. Jay looked around for an opening or seam on the back of the suit because there was none on the front, but there was none. However, whatever it was composed of was extremely elastic, so he might be able to escape via the neck opening, which was the sole entrance. Jay was surprised when he pushed on the neck area of the body-hugging garment, and it actively pulled back and resisted him. The garment felt like a super sticky glue trap, clinging to every inch of Jay's body with an incredibly powerful gooey grasp. The more Jay struggled, the more it became ingrained in him. The glued-on black muscle suit sprung to life. Jay attempted to sever it with a razor-sharp hunting knife, but the frightening blade only produced a little scrape on the surface of the rubbery muscle goo suit, which mended almost instantaneously. This was only the beginning of Jay's difficult situation. Jay was considering his gooey and very muscular wardrobe malfunction when he heard a huge boom of thunder. Jay discovered he had spider powers when he noticed himself clinging to the ceiling like a giant insect. Jay's wrists had developed 2 huge, veiny, and unsightly lumps. These turned out to be natural web shooters. The web shooters were connected to Jay's blood supply, as if they were his own organs like his kidneys or liver, and their major mass was embedded in each of Jay's arms among his arm muscles. Despite being manufactured by the suit, it was obvious that this was a permanent condition. This is going to be a tremendous problem, Jay realized. He could sense even stranger shifts going place. Jay felt a growl in his stomach. He was curiously hungry once more, despite what was happening to him. He jumped from the ceiling and began to prepare his meal. Jay had 50 pounds of fish from several successful fishing expeditions in his freezer. He only realized he'd eaten everything after frying and baking it, and then eating it all in one sitting. He also drank a lot of water. What is causing this? It had to be this dreadful suit. What happened to this thing? Jay swears he felt his bones dissolving and changing into muscle as these ideas raced through his mind. And his hopelessly unremovable outfit was becoming bigger. I need to see a doctor. However, he couldn't help but fall asleep after his massive meal. Jay fell asleep during a rainy and stormy day and awoke 12 hours later. He had grown from 140 pounds to 250 pounds of muscle and 18 inches taller, but his permanently stuck-on living muscle suit weighed 500 pounds, with the disconcerting way the wretched creature was now attached to him. Jay essentially weighed 750 pounds. The symbiote had molecularly merged with his flesh, and every cell in his body was now half symbiote. His DNA was half symbiotic. It was impossible to discern where Jay ended, and the symbiote he had become enslaved to began. Jay had an intuitive sense of this. To top it all off, his bones had vanished, replaced by muscle, as he discovered when he grabbed for a light switch 20 feet away and discovered that he now possessed super stretch abilities in addition to spider powers, organic web shooters, and super webs. Jay's improved vision meant that his spectacles were no longer required, and his once brown eyes had transformed into dazzling green ones. He'd never need another flashlight or lantern because he could see everything in the dark without them. Unfortunately, no surprises there. At the very least, I don't need glasses anymore, he thought to himself. Jay realized he now possessed incredible super strength, invulnerability, and regenerative abilities. He was incredibly super stretchy, practically indestructible, and had super spider powers and super webs and regeneration abilities, but he was now the parasite, completely dependent on the symbiote to support his body now that he didn't have bones. Jay could harden, soften, and expand at will, as well as withstand fire, ice, extreme heat, and cold. I'm a superpowered freak of nature, and to add insult to injury, I know it. This is the worst nightmare. That nightmare has one more terrifying permanent surprise in store for him. Jay felt a strange writhing sensation in his armpits. The symbiote suit developed a second pair of arms under Jay's own black clad, and now mega-muscular arms in seconds. Despite being fully formed of symbiotic muscle goo, they resembled his own suit-covered arms. Black goo nerves lodged in Jay's flesh connected these symbiote arms to his brain, allowing him to feel and control them. They had twice as much super webbing since they had organic web shooters like the ones embedded in Jay's own arms. Jay turned on his TV, which he hadn't watched in several days, in shock and unsure what to do. When Jay switched on his television, he noticed reports on every station about a single topic that was making headlines. That huge headline, of course, was an unstoppable new nationwide outbreak that began a week ago and was traced back to a blue space rock that had fallen to Earth in a field outside San Francisco. Thousands of people in America were infected with black symbiotes similar to the one Jay was now locked in for the rest of his life. Doctors' offices were flooded with people in the same predicament as Jay, and there was no cure or treatment available. It was impossible to stop its spread, since its ability to lurk inside the cells of its host rendered it invisible until it created the impenetrable black super spider suit. At this pace, everyone would be permanently stuck with one of these slimy, flexible, and impenetrable body-hugging permanent glue traps. Once their bones evolved into muscles, everyone would be forced to rely on the parasites to walk and execute basic commonplace activities, and they would all obtain the same superpowers Jay did, whether they wanted them or not. At the very least, Jay would not be alone or embarrassed to be seen in public. Why hide when everyone is sick? Being fused with a symbiote twice his weight was still no laughing matter for Jay. It seemed like he was being stuck up to his earlobes in a rubbery live tar hole that would never let go. The powers, superwebs, bonelessness, and whole-body Hulk-like physique that came with these monster giant symbiote muscles everywhere, and the mega strength to match, would be a significant life change. Jay would never get used to the strange sensation of a shiny black organism clinging to him and adhered to him like rubbery superglue, or being stuck in a permanent host-parasite relationship in which he was the dependent parasite. But he didn't have a choice. His own cells and DNA were half symbiotic under the large, hefty live muscle suit. Pure symbiotic cells were running through his veins and thriving inside all of his red blood cells. Those slimy muscle goo additional arms were connected to his brain by wire-like goo nerves that ran through his flesh and organs. Jay and his new large, body-hugging black friend, as he cynically referred to him, were absolutely inseparable in the most sickening way. Half of the time, he'd wake up the next day in a massive super spider web he'd created in his sleep rather than in his bed. The most alarming part was that he liked being stuck in this gooey, elastic, super sticky, glue rubber living tar pit body trap. This was probably for the best, because Jay's unusual illness was a life sentence. It didn't mean he'd ever get used to the strange sticky glue rubber sensation or anything else about it. Nobody knew how they got so big so fast. Half of the American populace was affected in 10 days and confined for life in mega-muscular black symbiotes that totally covered them up to their chins and earlobes like Jay. Surprisingly, civilization had not disintegrated as Jay and many others had predicted it would. Society continued to function virtually, as if everyone was oblivious to what had already happened to at least half of the inhabitants in every state on the mainland United States of America, with many also affected in Alaska and Hawaii. Jay was astounded but relieved that America hadn't imploded, even if California seceding from the Union to become its own country the day before the symbiotes were discovered in it, and a few other states wasn't doing that former state any favors. The Democratic Republic of California, or DRC, was facing multiple grave difficulties unrelated to the symbiote epidemic, and many of its wiser residents had moved to neighboring states to avoid losing their U.S. citizenship. Those who remained in the DRC faced food shortages, drought, rampant crime, including a murder rate 10 times that of the worst state, still a part of the United States of America, a failing economy, and a variety of struggling social programs that were doing more harm than good, sparking increasingly violent protests that had already caused major destruction and dozens of deaths in several cities. For whatever reason, few persons were infected with symbiotes in the DRC, and no reports of unclassified biology, altering parasites, or UBAPs as they were dubbed in the media, had arrived from any other country. Jay was still getting used to his new symbiotic life. The rest of the U.S. population was forced to rediscover life as arachnosuitors, as those infected with the symbiotes were now known. During the next 3 days, reports of UBAPs began to rise dramatically in the DRC as well. The DRC riots began to become less violent. It just took 21 days for the virus to infect the entire United States of America. America was literally muscle-bound, which meant being stuck in several hundred pounds of slimy symbiotic goo muscle that merges its DNA with yours against your will and sticks to you like the worst combination of glue, rubber, and fashion nightmare as a permanent living tar pit you wear that forces you to be the boneless parasite that depends on it, binding you to it for life. Surprisingly, no reports of UBAPs or arachnosuitors were found in any other country. 6 feet and 630 muscular pounds was now average adult size, therefore Jay was now significantly taller than average and one of the heaviest and strongest at 6 feet 9 inches and 790 pounds with his extra muscular symbiote. For some reason, his powerful symbiote had really muscled out and accumulated the extra 40 pounds when it produced the extra arms. Regardless of his or her muscular new size, everyone had extra arms. Jay had been richly rewarded for discovering a missing diamond wedding ring and returning it to the couple who had owned it 3 days after being infected and suited up by his symbiote, and he had donated the majority of his reward money to a charity that assisted Christian refugees fleeing unspeakable and horrific persecution in war-torn countries. With this donation, many of these people had been rescued, and Jay's feeder bug company was booming. Jay was able to use the money he made from selling feeder insects to go lionfish and other prized underwater game diving. He didn't need a wetsuit, fins, or dive mask to see underwater, and he could stay where the fish he targeted for much longer. When Jay dove, his symbiote produced an organic dive mask and organic fins, allowing him to stay underwater for hours without scuba gear by storing oxygen, which it released into his veins while he was underwater. On day 22, every news outlet carried a new headline. On the blue space rock that carried the first symbiote to Earth, a clue to the beginnings of this strange play had been discovered. A enigmatic collection of symbols on the internal wall of the hollow blue stone that could not have been carved by human hands. Surprisingly, all of the symbols were Old Hebrew letters. The message was evident, because those Hebrew characters formed words. Be than kful, for this gift. It is both a and and Use it wisely. Know who I am, and remember my laws. That night, Jay and millions of other Americans had intense dreams and visions of symbiotes giving a path for humanity to make the world a much better place and usher in an age of enlightenment, as well as about the rapture, tribulation, and great white throne judgment. Some of the dreams were lovely, while others were terrifying. In their sleep, everyone who had these visions and dreams saw and experienced the same things. Jay and the other symbiote-fused random Americans who had this experience felt moved and driven to tell those who didn't have visions what they witnessed that night. The message and warning these dreams seemed to carry seemed to be that it was either the symbiotes or the end of days, and that many would be left behind after the rapture to endure the tribulation, and thus the worst 7 years in history, with 100-pound blood-red hailstones mixed with fire raining from the sky, rivers and lakes turning into deadly poisonous blood, unimaginable horrors at the hands of the demon beast, and a foul plague worse than any currently known. The signs of this heinous sickness were terrifying. Fevered insanity, gut-wrenching, stabbing stomach pain, bloody vomiting and diarrhea, black and green necrotic lesions, unbearably painful festering boils, and sores filled with oozing, reeking, disease-spreading green and yellow pus that attracted flies and fat, wriggling, flesh-burrowing maggots with horrific hook-like mandibles, and frequent infestation with lice, ticks, flesh-eating. The symbiotes were a strange and harsh wake-up call to a wayward nation that was on a horrible road. They were creepy and repulsive, but they were far better than what would happen if America and the rest of the world remained on their current horrible and terribly miserable path. Instead of destroying the country, these life-giving organisms had rescued it. G grinned as he watched an encouraging report about how people were taking the message of the visions from the night before seriously. The social disaster that the previous 2 decades had transformed the United States of America, and by extension the rest of the globe, into was already changing for the better. Fine alloy, Jay exclaimed. At long last, finally, at long last, it's past time for folks to start caring. I was terrified I'd have to go through the anguish of watching the world die in front of my eyes for the rest of my life. I'm just in my mid-30s, but the condition of events on this planet made me feel like I was in my mid-90s until 2 weeks ago. Thank God, the horror is ended. This thing I'm locked in and fused with is no picnic, but being symbiote stuck for life is still preferable to spending the rest of my life on a planet that would have been absolutely insufferable if this hadn't happened and the end times hadn't come. G's neighbor concurred. For the rest of day 23, no new huge headlines broke on any of the news networks, but after sunset, many football-sized and shaped brilliant blue meteors identical to the initial symbiote-containing stone were spotted and reported falling from the sky around the world by witnesses. Every country on Earth, including America, received one sparkling blue meteorite.